When writing an academic paper, it is important to follow the grammar and style conventions, not only to abide by the accepted journal, institution, and domain standards, but to clearly communicate to the reader what you did, when you did it, and from which perspective you are discussing the research. And one central element that will impact how you compose your paper and how it will be understood by readers is verb tense. Everything in this paper has already been completed, so shouldn't I always use the past tense? Well, no, not exactly. Knowing which tense to use requires both understanding of the formatting style you're using, for example, APA, AMA, MLA, etc., and also some discretion and savvy in choosing the tense that makes the most sense for a given statement in the paper. Without going into specific rules for each formatting style, although new authors should definitely look at those rules first, let's talk today about some rules of thumb for when to use the past and present tense in different sections of the paper. There are three main verb tenses you should use in a research paper: present, simple past, and present perfect. Now we'll talk about which section requires which verb tense in a minute, but first let's go over the general usage rules for each of these tenses. The present tense, or as it's also referred to, the simple present tense, is used to talk about general facts, discuss current meanings and implications, and suggest future applications.
An example of a general fact would be, insulin and glucagon regulate blood glucose levels. This fact has no temporal change and is constant throughout time. An example of implications might be, increased glucose levels indicate decreased glucagon hormones. And for further research, further studies about glucagon receptors are needed.
The simple past is used to talk about events that have already been completed. These are usually discrete events, such as studies, experiments, or phenomenon that have happened in a locatable time or place in the past.
For an example of an event that has been completed at a certain time or place, in the course of this study, scientists discovered a new enzyme in the liver. Protocol X was used to analyze the data.
The present perfect tense is the least frequently used tense in your research paper. Its main purpose is to describe events that have occurred at some unidentified time in the past or have recently been completed or are still ongoing.
Here are some examples of the present perfect tense. Many studies have focused on glucagon as an important regulating hormone. Until recently, researchers have analyzed this kind of data using a chi-square statistic. Efforts have been made to understand more about this process. Note that in all of these examples, none of the events are given specific time or place indicators. All have occurred at some unidentified time in the past or are still being completed.
Now let's discuss which tense to use for each section of your research paper. Let's start with the abstract. In the abstract, generally the simple past is used, or for a concise introductory phrase, the present perfect is used. For general statements of facts, an analysis of findings, or for the paper itself, use the present tense.
For abstracts, in the introductory phrase, use the present perfect. Recent studies of glucagon and insulin production have led to breakthroughs in medicine. For statements of fact, as in other parts of your research paper, use the present tense. In the US, diabetes is the most common endocrine disease. You can also use the simple past for statements of fact that were determined to be true at a specific time. In 2016, diabetes was the most common endocrine disease.
In the introduction, use a mixture of present and past tense.
In the introduction, the present tense is applied when discussing a fact. With earlier research efforts by you or another group, use the past tense. This same research team discovered a similar enzyme in their 2012 study. For the concluding statements, use either the simple past or the past perfect. Prior research in this area was inconclusive. When discussing something that was determined to be true, but is no longer true, the past perfect is the way to describe this. This team had determined that X was Y, but this was later found to be incorrect.
In the literature section, knowing which tense to use can be a bit tricky, as it depends both on the manual of style that you're using, as well as on how exactly you are incorporating the literature. Let's look at some examples.
Use the present tense when giving your opinion on another person's research or when bringing up the results, discussion, and conclusion. For example, Ryuku concludes that there are no additional enzymes present in the liver, a finding this current study directly refutes. Some related terms that might be used are stresses, advocates, remarks, argues, and claims. In the methods section, Use the past tense to talk about what you did. A glucose molecule was added to the mixture to see how the peptide would respond. You will note here that the passive voice is used. If you use the active, then you usually need to use a pronoun or another subject. The passive is simply more common in most journal articles. Use the present tense when explaining diagrams, figures, tables, and charts. Table 5 displays the results of this first isolated test.
The verb tenses used for the results section are quite similar to those used for the methods.
Use the past to talk about actual results. The addition of 0.02 milligrams of glycogen activated receptor cells. No immediate effect was observed. Again, use the present tense to explain diagrams, figures, tables, and charts. Figure 1.4 shows the measurements of these mixtures. Or, the measurements of these mixtures are shown in figure 1.4. It is generally okay to mix the active and passive voice in these sections, if only to give your writing a little bit more variance and make it easier for the reader to understand.
In the discussion section, use the simple past to summarize your own findings and the perfect tense for cited information.
When summarizing your own findings, use the simple past. The experiment yielded a number of results associated with the processing of glucose. When discussing and interpreting the significance of your own findings, use the present tense. This study confirms that synthetic glucagon is 2/3 as effective at decreasing fatty acid synthesis. The reason for using the present tense here is to establish a dialogue between yourself and your study. You are essentially analyzing the work that has already been completed.
And in the conclusion, you can use the perfect tense to clarify that these statements still hold true at the time of your writing.
Results from this study have led to a deeper understanding about how different substrates interact with this enzyme. Use the present tense to apply findings, state implications, and suggest further research. We can conclude that endogenous glucagon is more essential in insulin regulation than previously understood. When discussing further research that is either needed or intended to be carried out, the future or present tense or subjunctive mood can also be used in addition to the present tense passive voice. For example, further clinical studies are needed to isolate the cause of this reaction. Further clinical studies will be needed to isolate the cause of this reaction. Or, further clinical studies should be carried out to isolate the cause of this reaction.
Follow these general rules about verb tense, and your paper will be clearer, more chronologically correct, and generally easier to read, meaning the important stuff in your paper will be more easily understood. And if you forget all of these rules, remember one golden rule of research papers. Check the formatting guidelines of the journal or conference to which you're submitting, and read plenty of examples to get an idea of how these authors construct the paper. You can always go back and edit the verb tense after you've written the paper. And remember that the more papers you read, the more papers you write, and the more you practice in general, the easier it will be to identify which verbs to use in which part of the research paper. If you would like to learn more about how to write your research paper and prepare it for submission to journals, visit wordvice.com. And don't forget to like and subscribe if this information has been helpful. Stay tuned for more, and happy writing.